Hey, I'm Bacon, and this is the eighth in the Innovations of Traveler video series. And I want to discuss something that it took me a little bit to refine down to what the video topic ended up being. So I'm going to touch on several topics. It initially started off as it was the original sandbox game. A lot of people attribute sandbox play specifically to Traveler in '77 when it was first published. But we're going to go over some things where I don't think that that's really a solid, honest, or fair assessment. And additionally, I have discussed Dungeons and Dragons very little in this, at least in detail, in this video series. But this one, we're going to get heavily into Dungeons and Dragons, the design philosophy of both of the two games, the trajectory that they took after they were initially published in through the 80s and the 90s. And we're going to see that Traveler, and this is the idea that I landed on, Traveler is the first no to low prep TTRPG. And I think that that's a pretty majorly significant innovation. Um, so let's start off with Dungeons and Dragons, though. So and pardon me, I'll be reading now because there's a lot of notes here. So I know my sight lines are going to be off, but please do bear with me. The relationship between original Dungeons and Dragons in '74 and sandbox style play is often overlooked in favor of later games like Traveler, like I just mentioned, which explicitly systematized procedural generation. However, OD&D had a very strong sandbox foundation that is evident when we examine its core design philosophy. OD&D was fundamentally a toolkit rather than a rigid, structured game. The rules were minimal, requiring the GM to fill in gaps and create much of the world themselves. That is key. Several design elements point toward an inherent sandbox approach. So there was open-ended world building. The Book of Monsters and Treasure includes generic rules for creating treasure hoards, magic items, wandering monsters. The game assumes that GMs will generate their own worlds rather than rely on pre-written narratives. The generation of their own worlds is key, and I would just, I think that, just remember it as we move on. Hex crawling and wilderness exploration. The game provides rules for mapping outdoor terrain, hex maps, and handling travel, including randomized encounters. So this suggests an intent for emergent play rather than pre-scripted storytelling. There were random tables for play direction, from dungeon stocking tables to wilderness encounter charts. OD&D encouraged referees to generate challenges dynamically rather than pre-planning every encounter. Minimal character backgrounds and loose narrative structure. So unlike later iterations of D&D, OD&D characters were simple. There was little focus on elaborate backstories. Players created meaning through gameplay rather than starting with pre-scripted motivations. And there were player-driven goals. There were no explicit adventure paths or grand narratives imposed by the rulebooks. Instead, players were their own objectives, whether treasure hunting, conquering strongholds, or exploring the unknown. And so while OD&D promoted freeform play, TSR actually quickly began publishing adventure modules. However, early modules were often closer to location-based sandboxes rather than story-driven adventures. Modules provided maps, traps, encounters, but they didn't dictate how the adventure had to unfold. That didn't happen until Dragonlance in 1984, and later 2E era adventure paths, the TSR began emphasizing more scripted play, complete with story beats and expected character progression. So comparing this to Traveler, it's often credited as the first true sandbox RPG because it included procedural world building as a core system, but I think this is going a bit too far. It's the play that defines the sandbox style, not necessarily world generation. The key distinction is that while OD&D had sandbox potential, it still relied on manual world building. Traveler, on the other hand, systematized randomness. Star systems, planets, patrons, and encounters could all be generated on the fly. Dungeons & Dragons operated off of the expectation of the game master to create the dungeons or the wilderness or the world that they were playing within. So in the world that Dungeons & Dragons created, where most tabletop role-playing games published in the 70s sought to emulate the direction and thereby the success of D&D, any game that came along and provided a lower prep requirement became the no to low prep option. That option was Traveler. But OD&D, as I previously mentioned, already had elements of that approach. There were the dungeon stocking rules, random encounter tables, focus on emergent world building, and it laid the groundwork for what Traveler took and refined into a more structured procedural generation system. So while Traveler may have been the first game to explicitly codify procedural generation as a primary design principle, thereby creating the design philosophy of no to low prep, OD&D was already fostering an emergent sandbox-like experience through its reliance on random tables, GM rulings, and open-ended gameplay. The key difference is that OD&D expected GMs to build the sandbox, whereas Traveler provided structured tools to generate it dynamically. So let's explore that in more detail. While OD&D was emergent in play, the GM was still expected to create a foundation before play began. Here's what that means. So a GM had to draw dungeon maps and then populate them with encounters using random tables. But we're more focusing on the fact that they had to draw the maps. They had to create the dungeons. Whether or not the dungeon was drawn, they had to create the dungeon. So even though there were details that emerged in play, treasure, wandering monsters, random encounters, the physical structure, the rooms, the corridors, the connections, was something that the GM created before play. You contrast this with Traveler, where a planet's details didn't need to exist until the PCs arrived and rolled for them. Hex crawls also required some pre-generation, I guess, or some prep. So OD&D style wilderness play used hex maps where terrain was predefined by the GM. While procedural elements, again, random encounters, weather, travel events, shaped the experience, the actual landmass and notable landmarks were sketched beforehand. In Traveler, the players could say, let's jump to the next system, and the GM could just generate an entirely new star system with entirely new planets on the fly. This is a completely different design philosophy than OD&D's world building. The GM was an author of spaces more than a narrator. So OD&D's GM wasn't telling a scripted story, but they did need to create a playable space that could be explored. This meant designing a dungeon, town, or region, again, as I've previously stated, but I feel like repeating these key elements is essential because this really is the truth here, at least insofar as I've been able to collect the facts. So this meant that designing a dungeon, town, or region that logically fit together, something that couldn't be done entirely through procedural generation at the table. So OD&D couldn't be truly prep-free because the sandbox needed somewhere to exist before the dice came into play. This is not a criticism. This is just a fact generated by the newness of Dungeons & Dragons and the role-playing hobby. Nothing else existed, and this was the approach that D&D took. So the expectation of this prep, the wilderness, the landmarks, the dungeons, led to modules and heavy prep play. It was a gradual evolution. So early GMs recognized the prep burden. And because running OD&D required designing dungeons, I'll get there, designing dungeons and drawing maps, there was a recognized time investment. And DMs began sharing dungeons amongst each other to save time. So, and these were the earliest proto modules, right? They weren't official products. They were handmade dungeons passed around by GMs. And then Blackmoor Dungeon and Castle Greyhawk were designed by Arneson and Gygax, but they were also played in multiple groups, right? So this is demonstrating how the single dungeon could be shared among many different campaigns because they had been previously built. They were the prep. Then TSR recognized the demand. They saw that GMs wanted pre-built dungeons to reduce their prep time, so they began publishing modules. The Keep on the Borderlands, Tomb of Horrors, etc., etc. These early modules were still location-based sandboxes, not scripted narratives. And then the modules evolved toward storytelling. By the mid-1980s, which was, again, the Dragonlance era, 1984, TSR shifted toward narrative-driven modules, expecting DMs to prep for specific story beats. This meant that Dungeons & Dragons moved from here is a place, do what you want, to here's a story, follow these events to resolve it. This increased prep time because DMs had to study the story arcs, the plot hooks, and the pre-designed encounters rather than just stocking dungeons randomly. And then the heavy prep model became the norm. As modules became more narrative-focused, DMs were expected to run pre-written adventures instead of creating their own sandboxes. And over time, D&D codified this style. AD&D rewarded backstories, forcing prep. 3rd edition and 4th edition encouraged encounter balancing, forcing additional prep. And 5th edition's official adventures are structured as long narratives, forcing additional prep. Thus, OD&D's necessity of some prep led to shared homebrew dungeons, which led to published modules, which led to story-driven adventures, which led to D&D's eventual reliance on heavy prep GMing. So again, just to summarize everything that we've gone through so far, OD&D was a low prep sandbox, but it wasn't fully procedural. The GM had to create physical spaces, dungeons and hex maps, for players to play. The prep burden led to shared homebrew dungeons, which evolved into official modules, and then modules started as sandboxes but became story-driven, leading to high prep plot-driven GM styling that later Dungeons and Dragons editions codified. So that is the trajectory of Dungeons and Dragons. Classic Traveler is the first truly no to low prep TTRPG. This is by the necessity of comparison, because Traveler came along and was requiring less prep than original Dungeons and Dragons. It became the progenitor of this philosophy. Unlike OD&D, where the GM needed pre-made dungeons and hex maps, Traveler was designed so that the universe could be generated as the players explored it. Now, I've already mentioned this, but bear with me, please. So this meant that almost nothing had to be prepared in advance. How did Traveler achieve this? There was, and I've gone through most of these bullet points in the video series. So there was procedural character generations. Characters were built using the life paths. There was no need to pick a class or write a backstory. The game generated it. There was procedural world generation. And so instead of mapping out a world or creating the bounds within the world, which in the world existed, creating the dungeon, the GM rolled planet size, atmosphere, population, law level, tech level, trade codes on the spot. Then there were also procedural encounters and missions. Patrons, which were quest givers, were rolled randomly, included motivations and potential twists. Space encounters, planetary encounters, trade missions, these were all handled through random generation and tables. And hex maps in Traveller could be blank. They could start blank. Unlike OD&D, where the GM needed to draw the world before play, a Traveller GM could start with a single starport and just let the universe emerge session by session. Traveller was the first RPG that truly required zero pre-session prep. The entire game world could be procedurally generated in real time during play. And so now I want to go over the trajectory that Traveller took up to a point, I guess probably current day even. So early Traveller adventures, which is what their modules were called, and their impact on prep. So while OD&D's early modules, like again, the Keep on the Borderlands, reinforced pre-built locations, Traveller's early modules were mostly toolkits, keeping procedural play intact. The first Traveller adventures. So again, unlike those D&D modules, which provided maps, dungeons, Traveller's modules were frameworks for generating content. So earlier adventures, like the Kinunir in 79 and Adventure 4 Leviathan in 80, didn't tell a scripted story. Instead, they provided locations, NPCs, and tools for procedural generation. Example, Leviathan presented a merchant campaign outline, but still relied on procedural tables for encounters, planets, and missions, etc. So the modules and the adventures were pretty analogous in the beginning. But so the modules in Traveller encouraged some prep, but the GM was still expected to roll and improvise rather than follow a rigid script. Traveller modules gave sandboxes, not stories, but they did introduce more detailed sector maps and NPC factions, increasing optional prep. So this prep that was introduced by the Traveller adventures was optional. There's still, again, this sort of almost one-for-one between the Traveller adventures and the D&D modules. But in Traveller, the prep was optional. The later Traveller editions evolved but never fully abandoned procedural play. But later editions did increase expectations for campaign structure and world coherence, not necessarily prep. So Mega Traveller in 87 and the shift toward predefined settings. So Mega Traveller introduced the Rebellion, which was a meta plot, optional, that created a more structured political backdrop. So GMs now had pre-existing factions and conflicts rather than just rolling up a random sector. And this did increase prep expectations because GMs had to familiarize themselves with an established setting if they wanted to use the setting. They didn't have to. Traveller, the New Era in 93 added even more optional prep, or optional pre-built lore, I should say. So it introduced a post-apocalyptic setting where the Imperium had collapsed. The GM was now expected to run games within a predefined historical framework, making pure procedural generation harder, but it was merely the historical context that was defined and not the story of the campaign itself. So it was still widely procedural, even though this particular update to Traveller did sort of close the edges in around it a little bit more. Then there's Mongoose Traveller from 2008 to the present. And Mongoose brought back classic Traveller's procedural style, but it also kept the detailed pre-written setting of the Third Imperium. GMs could, however, still ignore pre-built lore and generate a full campaign procedurally, but published material did encourage more structured prep than the original game did. So later editions never abandoned procedural generation, but introduced optional setting lore, making prep more structured for GMs who wanted it, but it wasn't necessary. So the trajectory of the trajectory of D&D toward high prep scripted play was due to the precedent set all the way back at the beginning of the hobby. It never lost the ability to run low prep sandbox style games, but the more time passed, the heavier into high prep plotted style the official materials leaned. Meanwhile, Traveller started off as the no to low prep design philosophy, and it did so better than any other game at the time of its original publication. So while it did grow to include setting details and heavier prep options, it never abandoned its core design philosophy as the first low to no prep TTRPG. This is the end of this particular series. Thank you so much for coming with me on this journey. Please do like and subscribe. I have additional videos planned for even as soon as next week. Some standalone topics. I'll be returning to some other series, the Young series I'll be returning to. So please do like and subscribe if you would like more of this. I really do appreciate you clicking by and watching the videos or commenting or whatever. I'll stop gushing. This is the end of the series. Thank you so much, everyone. And I will see you in the next one. Take care.